Schwab Family Values, an investigation into the past of Klaus Schwab by Johnny Vedmore, published by unlimitedhangout.com. This reading by Alex Thompson commences after the introduction to the article. On the 10th of July 1870, Klaus Schwab's grandfather, Jakob Wilhelm Gottfried Schwab, referred to later as simply Gottfried, was born in a Germany at war with its French neighbours. Karlsruhe, the town where Gottfried Schwab was born, was located in the Grand Duchy of Baden, ruled in 1870 by the 43-year-old Grand Duke of Baden, Frederick I. The following year, the aforementioned Duke would be present at the proclamation of the German Empire, which took place in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. He was the only son-in-law of the incumbent emperor, Wilhelm I, and, as Frederick I, was one of the reigning sovereigns of Germany. By the time Gottfried Schwab turned 18 years old, Germany would see Wilhelm II take the throne, upon the death of his father, Frederick III. In 1893, a 23-year-old Gottfried Schwab would officially depart Germany, giving up his German citizenship and leaving Karlsruhe in order to emigrate to Switzerland. At the time, his occupation was noted as being that of a simple baker. Here, Gottfried would meet Marie Lappert, who was from Kirchberg, near Bern, Switzerland, and who was 5 years his junior. They would marry in Roggwil, Bern, on the 27th of May 1898. And the following year, on the 27th of April 1899, their child, Eugen Schwab, was born. At the time of his birth, Gottfried Schwab had moved up in the world, having become a machine engineer. When Eugen was around 1 year old, Gottfried and Marie Schwab decided to return to live in Karlsruhe, and Gottfried reapplied for German citizenship. Eugen Schwab would follow in the footsteps of his father, and also became a machine engineer. And in future years, he would advise his children to do the same. Eugen Schwab would eventually begin working at a factory in a town in Upper Swabia, in southern Germany, capital of the district of Ravensburg, the present-day German state of Baden-Württemberg. The factory where Eugen would forge his career was the German branch of a Swiss company named Escher Wyss. Switzerland had many long-standing economic ties to the Ravensburg area, with Swiss traders in the early 19th century bringing in yarn and weaving products. In the same period, Ravensburg delivered grain to Rorschach, a Swiss town, until 1870, alongside breeding animals and various cheeses, deep within the Swiss Alps. Between 1809 and 1837, there were 375 Swiss people living in Ravensburg, though the Swiss population had dropped to 133 by 1910. In the 1830s, skilled Swiss workers set up a cotton factory with an incorporated bleaching and finishing plant, owned and maintained by the Epf brothers. The Ravensburg horse market, created in around 1840, also attracted many people from Switzerland, especially after the 1847 opening of the railway line from Ravensburg to Friedrichshafen, a town situated on the nearby Lake Constance, on the borderlands of Switzerland and Germany. Rorschach grain traders would make regular visits to the Ravensburger Kornhaus, Ravensburg Corn Exchange, and eventually this cross-border cooperation and trade also led to a branch of the Zurich machine factory, Escher Wyss and Company, opening in the city. This feat was made plausible once a train line connecting the Swiss to the German route network was completed between 1850 and 1853. The factory was set up by Walter Zuppinger between 1856 and 1859, and would begin production in 1860. In 1861, we can see the first official patent of the manufacturer's Escher Wyss in Ravensburg of, quote, peculiar facilities on mechanical looms for ribbon weaving, end quote. At this time, the Ravensburg branch of Escher Wyss would be directed by Walter Zuppinger, and would be where he developed his tangential turbine, and where he gained a number of additional patents. In 1870, Zuppinger, along with others, also founded a paper mill works in Bayernfurt, close to Ravensburg. He retired in 1875 and devoted all his energies to the further advance of turbines. At the turn of the 20th century, Escher Wyss had put the ribbon weaving to one side and had begun to concentrate on much bigger projects, like the production of large industrial turbines. And in 1907 they sought an approval and concession procedure for the construction of a hydropower plant near Dorgern am Rhein, which was reported in a Basel brochure from 1925. By 1920, Escher Wyss found themselves embroiled in serious financial difficulties. The Treaty of Versailles had restricted the military and economic growth of Germany following the Great War, and the Swiss company found the downturn in neighbouring national civil engineering projects too much to bear. The parent branch of Escher Wyss was located in Zurich and dated back to 1805, and the company, which still benefited from a good reputation and a history lasting more than a century, was deemed too important to lose. In December 1920, a reorganisation was carried out by writing down the share capital from 11.5 to 4.015 million French francs, which was later increased again to 5.515 million Swiss francs. By the end of the financial year of 1931, Escher Wyss was still losing money. Yet the plucky company continued to deliver large-scale civil engineering contracts throughout the 1920s, as noted in the official correspondence written in 1924 from Wilhelm III, Prince of Urach, to the company Escher Wyss, and to the asset manager of the House of Urach, accountant Julius Heller. This document discusses the general terms and conditions of the Association of German Water Turbine Manufacturers for the delivery of machines and other equipment for hydropower plants. This is also confirmed in a brochure on the Conditions of the Association of German Water Turbine Manufacturers for the Installation of Turbines and Machine Parts within the German Reich, printed on March 20th, 1923, in an advertising brochure from Escher Wyss for a universal oil pressure regulator. After the Great Depression in the early 1930s had laid waste to the global economy, Escher Wyss announced, quote, as the catastrophic development of the economic situation in connection with the currency declines, the company is temporarily unable to continue its current liabilities in various customer countries, end quote. The company also revealed that it would apply for a court deferral to the Swiss newspaper Neue Zürcher Nachrichten, which reported on the 1st of December 1931 that, quote, the company Escher Wyss has been granted a stay of bankruptcy until the end of March 1932, and, acting as curator in Switzerland, a trust company has been appointed, end quote. The article stated optimistically that there should be a prospect of continuing operations. In 1931, Escher Wyss employed around 1,300 non-contracted workers and 550 salaried employees. By the mid-1930s, Escher Wyss had again found itself in financial trouble. In order to rescue the company this time, a consortium was brought on board to save the ailing engineering firm. The consortium was partly formed by the Federal Bank of Switzerland, which was coincidentally headed by a Max Schwab, of no relation to Klaus Schwab. And further restructuring took place. In 1938, it was announced that an engineer at the firm, Colonel Jakob Schmidheiny, would become the new president of the board of directors at Escher Wyss. Soon after the outbreak of war in 1939, Schmidt-Heine was quoted as saying, "The outbreak of war does not necessarily mean unemployment for the machine industry in a neutral country. On the contrary." End quote. Escher Wyss and its new management were apparently looking forward to profiting off the war, paving the way for their transformation into a major Nazi military contractor. When Adolf Hitler came to power, many things changed in Germany, and the story of the Jewish population of Ravensburg during that era is a sad one to tell. Yet it was hardly the first time that anti-Semitism had been recorded as having reared its ugly head in the region. In the Middle Ages, a synagogue mentioned as far back as 1345 was located at the centre of Ravensburg, serving a small Jewish community which can be traced from 1330 to 1429. At the end of 1429 and through 1430, the Jews of Ravensburg were targeted and a horrific massacre ensued. In the nearby settlements of Lindau, Überlingen, Buchhorn, later renamed Friedrichshafen, Meersburg and Konstanz, there were mass arrests of Jewish residents. The Jews of Lindau were burnt alive during the 1429 to 1430 Ravensburg blood libel, in which members of the Jewish community were accused of ritually sacrificing babies. In August 1430, in Überlingen, the Jewish community was forced to convert. 11 of them did so, and the 12 who refused were killed. The massacres which took place in Lindau, Überlingen and Ravensburg happened with the direct approval of the ruling King Sigmund, and any remaining Jews were soon expelled from the region. Ravensburg had this ban confirmed by Emperor Ferdinand I in 1559, and it was upheld, for example, in an 1804 instruction issued for the city guard, which read, "Since the Jews are not allowed to engage in any trade or business here, no one else is allowed to enter the city by post or by carriage. The rest, however, if they have not received a permit for a longer or shorter stay from the police office, are to be removed from the city by the police station." Not until the 19th century were Jews able to settle legally in Ravensburg again, and even by then, their number remained so small that a synagogue was not rebuilt. In 1858 there were only 3 Jews recorded in Ravensburg, and in 1895 this number peaked at 57. From the turn of the century until 1933, the numbers of Jews living in Ravensburg had steadily decreased until the community was only made up of 23 people. By the start of the 1930s, there were 7 main Jewish families living in Ravensburg: the Adler, Erlanger, Harburger, Hermann, Landauer, Rose and Sondermann families. After the National Socialists seized power, some of the Ravensburg Jews were initially forced to emigrate, while others would later be murdered in Nazi concentration camps. In the lead-up to World War II, there were many public displays of hatred towards the small community of Jews in and around Ravensburg. As early as March the 13th, 1933, about 3 weeks before the nationwide Nazi boycott of all Jewish shops in Germany, Sturmabteilung Guards posted themselves in front of 2 of the 5 Jewish shops in Ravensburg and tried to prevent potential buyers from entering, putting up signs on one shop stating "Wohlwert closed until Aryanization." Wohlwerts would soon become Aryanized and would be the only Jewish-owned shop to survive the Nazi pogrom. The other owners of the 4 large Jewish department stores in Ravensburg, Knopf, Merkur, Landauer and Wallersteiner, were all forced to sell their properties to non-Jewish merchants between 1935 and 1938. During this period, many of the Ravensburg Jews were able to flee abroad before the worst of the National Socialist persecution began. While at least 8 died violently, it was reported that 3 Jewish citizens who lived in Ravensburg survived because of their Aryan spouses. Some of the Jews who were arrested in Ravensburg during Kristallnacht were forced to march through the streets of Baden-Baden under SS Guard supervision the following day, and were later deported to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Horrific Nazi crimes against humanity took place in Ravensburg. On the 1st of January 1934, the Law for the Prevention of Hereditary Diseases came into force in Nazi Germany, meaning people with diagnosed illnesses such as dementia, schizophrenia, epilepsy, hereditary deafness, and various mental disorders could be legally forcibly sterilized. In the Ravensburg City Hospital, today called Heilig Geist Hospital, forced sterilizations were carried out, beginning in April 1934. By 1936, sterilization was the most performed medical procedure in the municipal hospital. In the pre-war years of the 1930s, leading up to the German annexation of Poland, Ravensburg's Escher Wyss factory, now managed directly by Klaus Schwab's father Eugen Schwab, continued to be the biggest employer in Ravensburg. Not only was the factory a major employer in the town, but Hitler's own Nazi party awarded the Escher Wyss Ravensburg branch the title of National Socialist Model Company, while Eugen Schwab was at the helm. The Nazis were potentially wooing the Swiss company for cooperation in the coming war, and their advances were eventually reciprocated. Ravensburg was an anomaly in wartime Germany, as it was never targeted by any Allied airstrikes. The presence of the Red Cross and a rumoured agreement with various companies, including Escher Wyss, saw the Allied forces publicly agree not to target the southern German town. It was not classified as a significant military target throughout the war, and for that reason the town still maintains many of its original features. However, much darker things were afoot in Ravensburg once the war began. Eugen Schwab continued to manage the National Socialist Model Company, Escher Wyss, and the Swiss company would aid the Nazi Wehrmacht in producing significant weapons of war, as well as more basic armaments. The Escher Wyss company was a leader in large turbine technology for hydroelectric dams and power plants, but they also manufactured parts for German fighter planes. They were also intimately involved in much more sinister projects happening behind the scenes, which, if completed, could have changed the outcome of World War II. Western military intelligence was already aware of Escher Wyss's complicity and collaboration with the Nazis. There are records available from Western military intelligence at the time, specifically Record Group 226, from the data compiled by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the US precursor to the CIA, which shows that Allied forces were aware of some of Escher Wyss's business dealings with the Nazis. Within Record Group 226, there are 3 specific mentions of Escher Wyss. File number 47178, which reads, Escher Wyss of Switzerland is working on a large order for Germany. Flamethrowers are dispatched from Switzerland under the name Brennstoffbehälter, dated September 1944. Brennstoffbehälter means fuel containers. File number 41589 showed that the Swiss were allowing German exports to be stored in their country, a supposedly neutral nation during World War II. The entry reads, Business relations between Empresa Nacional Calvo Sotelo, Encaso, Escher Wyss and Mineralzellbaugesellschaft, 1 page, July 1944. The archive notes see also L42627, Report on collaboration between the Spanish Empresa Nacional Calvo Sotelo and the German Rheinmetall Borsig on German exports stored in Switzerland, 1 page, August 1944. And thirdly, file number 72654 claimed that Hungary's bauxite was formerly sent to Germany and Switzerland for refining. Then, a government syndicate built an aluminium plant at Dunaolmás on the borders of Hungary. Electric power was provided, Hungary contributed coal mines, and equipment was ordered from the Swiss firm Escher Wyss. Production began in 1941. 2 pages, May 1944. Yet Escher Wyss were leaders in one blossoming field in particular, the creation of new turbine technology. The company had engineered a 14,500 horsepower turbine for the Norsk Hydro Industrial Facility's strategically important hydroelectric plant at Vedmore near Rjukan in Norway. The Norsk Hydro plant, part powered by Escher Wyss, was the only industrial plant under Nazi control capable of producing heavy water, an essential ingredient for making plutonium for the Nazi atomic bomb program. The Germans had put all possible resources behind the production of heavy water, but the Allied forces were aware of the potentially game-changing technological advances by the increasingly desperate Nazis. During 1942 and 1943, the hydro plant was the target of partially successful British commando and Norwegian resistance raids, although heavy water production continued. The Allied forces would drop more than 400 bombs on the plant, which barely affected the operations at the sprawling facility. In 1944, German ships attempted to transport heavy water back to Germany, but the Norwegian resistance was able to sink the ship carrying the payload. With help from Escher Wyss, the Nazis were almost able to change the tides of war and bring about an Axis victory. Back in the Escher Wyss factory in Ravensburg, Eugen Schwab had been busy putting forced labourers to work at his model Nazi company. During the years of World War II, nearly 3,600 forced labourers worked in Ravensburg, including at Escher Wyss. According to the city archivist of Ravensburg, Andreas Schmuder, the Escher Wyss machine factory in Ravensburg employed between 198 and 203 civil workers and prisoners of war during the war. Karl Schweitzer, a local Lindau historian, states that Escher Wyss maintained a small special camp for forced labourers on the factory premises. The use of masses of forced labourers in Ravensburg made it necessary to set up one of the largest recorded Nazi forced labour camps in the workshop of a former carpenter's at Ziegelstrasse 16. At one time, the camp in question accommodated 125 French prisoners of war, who were later redistributed to other camps in 1942. The French workers were replaced by 150 Soviet prisoners of war, who, it was rumoured, were treated the worst out of all the prisoners of war. One such prisoner was Zina Yakusheva, whose work card and workbook are held by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. These documents identify her as a non-Jewish forced labourer assigned to Ravensburg, Germany during 1943 and 1944. Eugen Schwab would dutifully maintain the status quo during the war years. After all, with young Klaus Martin Schwab having been born in 1938, and his brother Urs Rainer Schwab born a few years later, Eugen would have wanted to keep his children out of harm's way. Born on the 30th of March 1938 in Ravensburg, Germany, Klaus Schwab was the eldest child in a normal nuclear family. Between 1945 and 1947, Klaus attended primary school in Au, Germany. Klaus Schwab recalls in a 2006 interview with the Irish Times that, "After the war, I chaired the Franco-German Regional Youth Association. My heroes were Adenauer, de Gasperi and de Gaulle." Klaus Schwab and his younger brother Urs Rainer Schwab were both to follow in the footsteps of their grandfather Gottfried and their father Eugen, and would both initially train as machine engineers. Klaus's father had told the young Schwab that if he wanted to make an impact on the world, then he should train as a machine engineer. This would only be the beginning of Schwab's university credentials. Klaus began studying his plethora of degrees at Spohn Gymnasium, Ravensburg, between 1949 and 1957, eventually graduating from the Humanistisches Gymnasium in Ravensburg. Between 1958 and 1962, Klaus began working with various engineering companies, and in 1962 Klaus completed his mechanical engineering studies at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH, in Zurich, with an engineering diploma. The following year, he also completed an economics course at the University of Fribourg, Switzerland. From 1963 until 1966, Klaus worked as an assistant to the Director General of the German Machine Building Association, VDMA, in Frankfurt. In 1965, Klaus was also working on his doctorate from the ETH Zurich, writing his dissertation on the longer-term export credit as a business problem in mechanical engineering. Then, in 1966, he received his doctorate in engineering from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH, Zurich. By this time, Klaus's father, Eugen Schwab, was swimming in bigger circles than he had previously swum in. After being a well-known personality in Ravensburg, and as the managing director of the Escher Wyss factory from before the war, Eugen would eventually be elected as president of the Ravensburg Chamber of Commerce. In 1966, during the founding of the German Committee for Splügen Railway Tunnel, Eugen Schwab defined the founding of the German Committee as a project that creates a better and faster connection for large circles in our increasingly converging Europe, and thus offers new opportunities for cultural, economic and social development. In 1967, Klaus Schwab gained a doctorate in economics from the University of Fribourg, Switzerland, as well as a master in public administration from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. While at Harvard, Schwab was taught by Henry Kissinger, who he would later say was among the top 3 or 4 figures who had most influenced his thinking over the course of his entire life. In the previously mentioned Irish Times article of 2006, Klaus Schwab talks about that period as being very important to the formation of his present ideological thinking, stating, "Years later, when I came back from the United States after my studies at Harvard, there were 2 events that had a decisive triggering effect on me. The first was a book by Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, The American Challenge, which said Europe would lose out against the United States because of Europe's inferior management methods. The other event was, and this is relevant to Ireland, the Europe of 6 became the Europe of the 9. These 2 events would help shape Klaus Schwab into a man who wanted to change the way people went about their business. That same year, Klaus's younger brother, Urs Rainer Schwab, graduated from ETH Zurich as a mechanical engineer, and Klaus Schwab went to work for his father's old company, Escher Wyss, soon to become Sulzer Escher Wyss Aktiengesellschaft Zurich, as assistant to the chairman to aid in the reorganization of the merging companies. This leads us towards Klaus's nuclear connections. The rise of a technocrat. Sulzer, a Swiss company whose origins date back to 1834, had first risen to prominence after starting to build compressors in 1906. By 1914, the family-run firm had become part of 3 joint stock companies, one of which was the official holding company. In the 1930s, Sulzer's profits would suffer during the Great Depression, and, like many businesses at the time, it faced disruption and industrial actions from its workers. World War II may not have affected Switzerland as much as her neighbours, but the economic boom that was to follow led to Sulzer growing in power and market dominance. In 1966, just before the arrival of Klaus Schwab at Escher Wyss, the Swiss turbine manufacturers signed a cooperation agreement with the Sulzer brothers in Winterthur. Sulzer and Escher Wyss would begin to merge in 1966 when Sulzer purchased 53% of the company's shares. Escher Wyss would officially become Sulzer Escher Wyss AG in 1969, when the last of the shares were acquired by the Sulzer brothers. Once the merger had started, Escher Wyss would begin to be restructured, and 2 of the existing board members would be the first to find their service to Escher Wyss coming to an end. Dr. H. Schindler and W. Stoffel would resign from the board of directors, now headed by Georg Sulzer and Alfred Schaffner. Dr. Schindler had been a member of the Escher Wyss board of directors for 28 years and had worked alongside Eugen Schwab throughout much of his service. Peter Schmidheiny would later take over as chairman of the board of directors of Escher Wyss, continuing the Schmidheiny family rule over the company's executives. During the restructuring process, it was decided that Escher Wyss and Sulzer would concentrate on separate areas of machine engineering, with the Escher Wyss factories primarily working on hydraulic power plant construction, including turbines, storage pumps, reversing machines, closing devices and pipelines, as well as steam turbines, turbo compressors, evaporation systems, centrifuges and machines for the paper and pulp industry, while Sulzer would concentrate on the refrigeration industry, as well as steam boiler construction and gas turbines. On the 1st of January 1968, the freshly reorganised Sulzer Escher Wyss AG was rolled out publicly, and the company had become streamlined, a move deemed necessary because of several large acquisitions. This included a close collaboration with Braun Boveri, a group of Swiss electric engineering companies who had also worked for the Nazis, supplying the Germans with some of their U-boat technology used during World War II. Braun Boveri was also described as defence-related electrical contractors, and would find the conditions of the Cold War arms race to be beneficial to their business. The merger and reorganisation of these Swiss mechanical engineering giants saw their collaboration pay off in unique ways. During the 1968 Winter Olympics in Grenoble, Sulzer and Escher Wyss used 8 refrigeration compressors to create tons of artificial ice. In 1969, the 2 firms combined to help in the building of a new passenger ship named the Hamburg, the first ship in the world to be fully air-conditioned, thanks to the Sulzer-Escher Wyss combination. In 1967, Klaus Schwab officially burst onto the scene of the Swiss business community and took a lead in the merger between Sulzer and Escher Wyss, as well as forming profitable alliances with Braun Boveri and others. In December 1967, Klaus spoke at a Zurich event to the top Swiss machine engineering organizations, the Employers Association of Swiss Machine and Metal Manufacturers and the Association of Swiss Machine Manufacturers. In his talk, he correctly predicted the importance of incorporating computers into modern Swiss machine engineering, stating that in 1971, products that are not even on the market today are likely to account for up to a quarter of sales. This requires companies to systematically research possible developments and identify gaps in the market. Today, 18 of the 20 largest companies in our machine industry have planning departments that are entrusted with such tasks. Of course, everyone has to make use of the latest technological advances, and the computer is one of them. The many small and medium-sized companies in our machine industry take the path of cooperation or use the services of special data processing service providers. Computers and data were obviously seen as important to the future, according to Schwab. And this was further projected in the reorganization of Sulzer-Escher Wyss during their merger. Sulzer's modern website reflects this noteworthy change in direction, stating that in 1968, material technology activities were intensified by Sulzer and formed the basis for medical technology products. The fundamental change from a machine building company to a technology corporation started to become apparent. End quote. Klaus Schwab was helping to turn Sulzer-Escher Wyss into something more than just a machine building giant. He was transforming it into a technology corporation driving at high speed into a high-tech future. It should also be noted that Sulzer-Escher Wyss changed another focus of its business to help it quote, formed the basis for medical technology products, end quote. An area not previously mentioned as a target industry for Sulzer or Escher Wyss. But technological advancement wasn't the only upgrade that Klaus Schwab wanted to introduce at Sulzer Escher Wyss. He also wanted to change how the company thought about its business managerial style. Schwab and his close associates were pushing an entirely new business philosophy, which would allow all employees to accept the imperatives of motivation to ensure at home a sense of flexibility and maneuverability. It is here, in the late 1960s, that we see Klaus Schwab begin to emerge as a more public figure. At this time, the Sulzer Escher Wyss company also became more interested in engaging with the press than ever before. In January 1969, the Swiss giants set up a public advisory session entitled The Press Day of the Machine Industry, which mainly concerned questions on company management. During the event, Schwab would state that companies using authoritarian styles of business management are unable to fully activate the human capital, an argument he would use on many separate occasions during the late 1960s. Plutonium and Pretoria. Escher Wyss were pioneers in some of the most important technology in power generation. As the US Department of Energy points out in its paper on supercritical carbon dioxide Brayton cycle development, CBC, a device used in hydro and nuclear power plants, quote, Escher Wyss was the first company known to develop the turbo machinery for CBC systems, starting in 1939. End quote. It goes on to state that 24 such systems were built, quote, with Escher Wyss designing the power conversion cycles and building the turbo machinery for all but 3. End quote. By 1966, just before the entrance of Schwab into Escher Wyss and the start of the Sulzer merger, the Escher Wyss helium compressor was designed for the Lafleur Corporation and continued the evolution of the Brayton cycle development. This technology was still of importance to the arms industry by 1986, with nuclear-powered drones being equipped with a helium-cooled Brayton cycle nuclear reactor. Escher Wyss had been involved with manufacturing and installing nuclear technology at least as early as 1962. As shown by a patent for a heat exchange arrangement for a nuclear power plant, and a patent from 1966 for a nuclear reactor gas turbine plant with emergency cooling. After Schwab left Sulzer Escher Wyss, Sulzer would also help to develop special turbo compressors for uranium enrichment to yield reactor fuels. When Klaus Schwab joined Sulzer Escher Wyss in 1967 and started the reorganization of the company to be a technology corporation, the involvement of Sulzer Escher Wyss in the darker aspects of the global nuclear arms race became immediately more pronounced. Before Klaus Schwab became involved, Escher Wyss had often concentrated on helping to design and build parts for civilian uses of nuclear technology, such as nuclear power generation. Yet, with the arrival of the eager Mr. Schwab, also came the company's participation in the illegal proliferation of nuclear weapons technology. By 1969, the incorporation of Escher Wyss into Sulzer was fully completed, and they would be rebranded into Sulzer AG, dropping the historic name Escher Wyss from their name. It was eventually revealed, thanks to a review and report carried out by the Swiss authorities and a man named Peter Hug, that Sulzer Escher Wyss began secretly procuring and building key parts for nuclear weapons during the 1960s. The company, while Schwab was on the board, also began playing a critical role in the development of South Africa's illegal nuclear weapons program during the darkest years of the apartheid regime. Klaus Schwab was a leading figure in the founding of a company culture which helped Pretoria build 6 nuclear weapons and partially assemble a 7th. In that report, Peter Hoog outlined how Sulzer Escher Wyss AG, referred to post-merger as just Sulzer, had supplied vital components to the South African government and found evidence of Germany's role in supporting the racist regime, also revealing that the Swiss government, quote, was aware of illegal deals but tolerated them in silence, while supporting some of them actively, or criticising them only half-heartedly, end quote. Hoog's report was eventually finalised in a work entitled Switzerland and South Africa, 1948 to 1994, final report of the NFP 42+, commissioned by the Swiss Federal Council. Note, the Swiss Federal Council is a 7-person equivalent of the presidency of other countries. This report was compiled and written by Georg Kreis and published in 2007. By 1967, South Africa had constructed a reactor as part of a plan to produce plutonium, the Safari 2, located at Pelindaba. Safari 2 was part of a project to develop a reactor moderated by heavy water, which would be fueled by natural uranium and cooled using sodium. This link to developing heavy water for the creation of uranium, the same technology which had been utilised by the Nazis, also with the help of Escher Wyss, may explain why the South Africans initially got Escher Wyss involved. But by 1969, South Africa abandoned the heavy water reactor project at Pelindaba because it was draining resources from their uranium enrichment program that had first begun in 1967. In 1970, Escher Wyss was definitely deeply involved with nuclear technology, as seen in a record available in the Landesarchiv Baden-Württemberg, or State Archive. The record shows details of a public procurement process and contains information about award talks with specific companies involved in the procurement of nuclear technology and materials. The companies cited include Nukem, Uhde, Krantz, Preussag, Escher Wyss, Siemens, Rheintal, Leibold, Lurgi, and the infamous Transnuclear. The Swiss and South Africans had a close relationship through this period of history, when it was hardly easy for the brutal South African regime to find close allies. By the 4th of November 1977, the United Nations Security Council had enacted Resolution 418, which imposed a mandatory arms embargo against South Africa, an embargo that wouldn't be fully lifted until 1994. Georg Kreis pointed out the following in his detailed assessment of the Hoog report. Quote, the fact that the authorities assumed a laissez-faire attitude, even after May 1978, comes to the fore in an exchange of letters between the anti-apartheid movement and the Swiss Federal Department of Military Affairs, DFMA, in October to December 1978. As the study by Hoog explains, the anti-apartheid movement of Switzerland pointed to German reports, according to which Sulzer Escher Wyss and a company called BBC had supplied parts for the South African uranium enrichment plant and had repeated credits to Eskom, the South African public utility, which also included considerable contributions by Swiss banks. These assertions led to questions of whether the Swiss Federal Council, in light of fundamental support of the UN embargo, ought not to instigate the Swiss National Bank to stop authorising credits for Eskom in the future. End quote. Swiss banks would help to fund the South African race to nukes, and by 1986, Sulzer Escher Wyss were successfully producing special compressors for uranium enrichment. The founding of the World Economic Forum. In 1970, the young upstart Klaus Schwab wrote to the European Commission and asked for help in setting up a non-commercial think tank for European business leaders. The European Commission sponsored the event as well, sending French politician Raymond Barre to act as the forum's intellectual mentor. Raymond Barre, who was at that time the European Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, would later go on to be French Prime Minister and would be accused of making anti-Semitic comments while in office. So, in 1970, Schwab left Escher Wyss to organise a 2-week business managerial conference. In 1971, the first meeting of the World Economic Forum, then called the European Management Symposium, convened in Davos, Switzerland. Around 450 participants from 31 countries would take part in Schwab's first European Management Symposium, mostly made up of managers from various European companies, politicians, and US academics. The project was recorded as being organised by Klaus Schwab and his secretary Hilde Stoll, who the same year would become Klaus Schwab's wife. Klaus Schwab's European Symposium was not an original idea. As writer Ganga J. Aratnam stated quite coherently in 2018, quote, Klaus Schwab's spirit of Davos was also the spirit of Harvard. Not only had the business school advocated the idea of a symposium, prominent Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith championed the affluent society, as well as capitalism's planning needs and the rapprochement of East and West. End quote. It was also true that, as Aratnam pointed out, this was not the first time Davos had hosted such events. Between 1928 and 1931, the Davos University Conferences took place at the Hotel Belvedere, events which were co-founded by Albert Einstein and were only halted by the Great Depression and the threat of looming war. The most influential group that spurred the creation of Klaus Schwab's symposium was the Club of Rome, an influential think tank of the scientific and moneyed elite that mirrors the World Economic Forum in many ways, including in its promotion of a global governance model led by a technocratic elite. The club had been founded in 1968 by Italian industrialist Aurelio Peccei and Scottish chemist Alexander King during a private meeting at a residence owned by the Rockefeller family in Bellagio, Italy. Among its first accomplishments was a 1972 book entitled The Limits to Growth, that largely focused on global overpopulation, warning that, quote, if the world's consumption patterns and population growth continued at the same high rates of the time, the Earth would strike its limits within a century, end quote. At the third meeting of the World Economic Forum in 1973, Peccei delivered a speech summarising the book, which the World Economic Forum website remembers as having been the distinguishing event of this historical meeting. That same year, the Club of Rome would publish a report detailing an adaptive model for global governance that would divide the world into 10 interconnected economic political regions. The Club of Rome was long controversial for its obsession with reducing the global population, and many of its earlier policies, which critics described as influenced by eugenics and neo-Malthusian. However, in the club's infamous 1991 book, The First Global Revolution, it was argued that such policies could gain popular support if the masses were able to link them with an existential fight against a common enemy. To that effect, the book The First Global Revolution contains a passage entitled The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man, which states the following, quote, in searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill in their totality and their interactions these phenomena do constitute a common threat, which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designating these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap, which we have already warned readers about, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself." End quote. In the years since, the elite that populate the Club of Rome and the World Economic Forum have frequently argued that population control methods are essential to protecting the environment. It is thus unsurprising that the World Economic Forum would similarly use the issues of climate and environment as a way to market otherwise unpopular policies, such as those of the Great Reset, as necessary. Since the founding of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab has become one of the most powerful people in the world, and his Great Reset has made it more important than ever to scrutinise the man sitting on the globalist throne. Given his prominent role in the far-reaching effort to transform every aspect of the existing order, Klaus Schwab's history was difficult to research. When you start to dig into the history of a man like Schwab, who sits aloft other shadowy elite movers and shakers, you soon find lots of information has been hidden or removed. Klaus Schwab is somebody who wants to stay hidden in the shadowy corners of society, and who will only allow the average person to see a well-presented construct of their chosen persona. Is the real Klaus Schwab a kindly old uncle figure, wishing to do good for humanity? Or is he really the son of a Nazi collaborator who used slave labour and helped the Nazi efforts to obtain the first atomic bomb? Is Klaus Schwab the honest business manager whom we should trust to create a fairer society and workplace for the common man? Or is he the person who helped push Sulzer Escher-Wyss into a technological revolution that led to its role in the illegal creation of nuclear weapons for South Africa's racist apartheid regime? The evidence I have looked at does not suggest a kindly man, but rather a member of a wealthy, well-connected family that has a history of helping create weapons of mass destruction for aggressive racist governments. As Klaus Schwab said in 2006, "Knowledge will soon be available everywhere. I call it the Googleization of globalization. It's not what you know anymore, it's how you use it. You have to be a pace setter." Klaus Schwab considers himself to be a pace setter and a top-table player. And it must be said that his qualifications and experience are impressive. Yet, when it comes to practicing what you preach, Klaus Schwab has been found out. One of the three biggest challenges on the priority list for the World Economic Forum is the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, yet neither Klaus Schwab nor his father Eugen lived up to those same principles when they were in business. Quite the opposite. In January, Klaus Schwab announced that 2021 is the year that the World Economic Forum and its allies must rebuild trust with the masses. However, if Schwab continues to hide his history and that of his father's connections to the National Socialist model company that was Escher-Wyss during the 1930s and 1940s, then people will have good reason to distrust the underlying motivations of his overreaching, undemocratic Great Reset agenda. In the case of the Schwabs, the evidence doesn't point at simply poor business practices or some sort of misunderstanding. The story of the Schwab family instead reveals a habit of working with genocidal dictators for the base motives of profit and power. The Nazis and the South African apartheid regime are two of the worst examples of leadership in modern politics, yet the Schwabs obviously couldn't or wouldn't see that at the time. In the case of Klaus Schwab himself, it appears that he has helped to launder relics of the Nazi era, i.e. its nuclear ambitions and its population control ambitions, so as to ensure the continuity of a deeper agenda. While serving in a leadership capacity at Sulzer Escher Wyss, the company sought to aid the nuclear ambitions of the South African regime, at the time the most Nazi-adjacent government in the world, preserving Escher Wyss's own Nazi-era legacy. Then, through the World Economic Forum, Schwab has helped to rehabilitate eugenics-influenced population control policies during the post-World War II era, a time when the revelations of Nazi atrocities quickly brought the pseudoscience into great disrepute. Is there any reason to believe that Klaus Schwab, as he exists today, has changed in any way? Or is he still the public face of a decades-long effort to ensure the survival of a very old agenda? The last question that should be asked about the real motivations behind the actions of Herr Schwab may be the most important for the future of humanity. Is Klaus Schwab trying to create the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or is he trying to create the Fourth Reich?